So let's talk. Let's set this historically now. And I'm thinking of kind of three sort of main areas: the Patriot Act,
hmm
the reauthorization of the Patriot Act, that whole trajectory starting from after September 11th to a couple of months ago when it was quickly ushered back through Congress with Nancy Pelosi's leadership and eagerly signed by Trump. Uh, I want to then, of course, the Snowden revelations on the scale of NSA surveillance. And actually, this app, it's simply unavoidable. The case against Julian Assange, what he's actually being prosecuted for, is journalism. In terms of this specific charges, and even the ways in which they try to sort of complicate the case, and it would basically, I mean, the way these charges are written, any normal investigative journalist that says, "Hey, do you have information on something? Hit me on Signal," could essentially be, covered by what they're charging Assange with. So, can you just give us that sort of and add more or whatever you want, just the roadmap of how we've gotten where we are in terms of this level of surveillance, and also the relationship between the government and the corporate sector, so that kind of libertarian, like, it's okay if we have a private surveillance economy, right? That the way it's actually merged.
Yes.
Um,
We'll start with the Patriot Act. I think that's a fine place to locate it. And for me, it was very alarming. I was in law school at the time. And my focus when the Patriot Act was passed in 2001, when it was rammed through Congress without a debate, without any consideration of its potential impacts, basically pulled off the shelf. It was written before the 9/11 attacks, and it was passed in response to them by a body composed of members who hadn't even read the bill. When that all happening, I was studying what passes for law in this country, and I watched that happen in front of me. And I think a lot of people were wondering, how exactly does this square with anything I'm learning about in law school? And it's striking because that pattern repeated itself. It was about 7 years later, in 2008, in the middle of a presidential campaign, that President, then Senator Barack Obama, wrote a public defense of why he was choosing to vote for a law as a Democratic senator that extended and essentially statutorily ratified the power grab by the Bush administration that it had pursued in the wake of the attacks. And that made it bipartisan. And then when Obama came into office, repeatedly reauthorizing not just the Patriot Act, but then also defending extensions of that surveillance authority into other dimensions. For instance, people think about mass surveillance as a problem with three-letter agencies: the NSA, the CIA, the FBI. That shoe fits, but every police department in the United States is up to its neck in the very same problems. They have not just military gear, but particularly military surveillance equipment that has no business being in the hands of civilian authorities. I'm talking about devices, for instance, that can intercept or even jam cell phone transmissions, devices that can map and track the locations of residents over time. These are not devices and programs that, for instance, conduct persistent aerial surveillance of entire cities. And these are not the powers that are consistent with our claim of living in a free society. You can't be free when you're watched all the time, period. You might still feel free. You're free to go shopping. You're free to be denied a test kit and die of a preventable pandemic. You're free to do any number of things, but in the United States, you're not free to simply do what you want without being watched. And that is a core protection in our Constitution for a reason. And this is the crucial part. It's not privacy that keeps me up at night. It is the threat to dissent. These surveillance measures are not security promoting. They are career promoting. They are career reinforcing, and they are power insulating. That's how surveillance has always been used in our past. In the United States, we have an over 100-year history of government surveillance being used to undermine dissent from environmental groups, dissent from Native Americans, from Puerto Rican independence activists, from civil rights activists, from Black power nationalists, from white supremacists, people advocating for the equal rights for women, people advocating for peace in the face of US military interventions in other countries. In all these contexts, Americans pursuing their constitutionally protected rights have been treated like criminals by our government. It's unacceptable. And I want to remix here Naomi Klein's Shock Doctrine, and it'll tie into the question you raised about the corporate public connection. Naomi Klein in the Shock Doctrine explains how in times of economic crisis abroad, historically, major corporations and international financial institutions like the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. These are US steered and partially led organizations, that they take advantage of these crises to impose austerity measures, to privatize businesses and enterprises that used to be held in the public sector by the people, and basically laying waste to the rights and entitlements of communities that have sought, for instance, opportunities for support for food programs or housing programs or healthcare programs from their respective governments. That program is now being instituted in the United States. We are seeing the coronavirus used as a pretext to impose not just the privatization of services, but particularly authoritarian power grabs. That's an incredibly gnarly version of the shock doctrine, because it's not just economic. This goes to our deepest norms. It could very dramatically impact the contour of our society that emerges from this crisis. And the question in my mind is not whether we have privacy, it's whether we can speak our minds. And if we can't speak our minds, that is the nail in the coffin of our democracy.
Absolutely. And I just want to say, I really appreciate too that you gave us a full tour of groups that, in a lot of cases are fighting for things that we would strongly support. Maybe in other cases are fighting for, or are advocating for things that we would support in ways that we would disagree with. And also abominable groups, white supremacists, people interested in various extremist religious ideologies. And this is actually, I think, another thing that I've really admired about you, and I think we really need to hold, is the notion that it is reintroducing very clearly and very thoroughly the concept that constitutional rights and protections, and I would say also a culture around that, needs to apply to all. That doesn't mean, obviously, that you don't take the appropriate measures to actually prevent violence and harm, but there has been a cultural drift, I think, that flows through, kind of social conventions online and much more ominously, on a policy level of, it's become so normalized, the conflation of, okay, here's a threat, here's a neo-Nazi group, here's Al-Qaeda. Yes, those groups present threats, and clearly they have toxic, grotesque ideologies, then gets shifted to, so we need to completely throw out the book of what actually protects us all, not to mention civilians, not to mention innocent people who get caught up, not to mention actually intelligent measures that we actually know from the de-radicalization world of how you actually de-radicalize people, which has very little to do, mostly with mass surveillance, torture, detention, and so on. So I really want to appreciate that you're holding that as well, because a lot of us, I think, have lost it, and we better reassert it in times like this. And can you talk about how this fight around civil liberties, as well as your serious advocacy of universal healthcare, housing, and so on, relates to a kind of fusion between, positive and negative liberty that are usually kind of foolishly put as being against each other? And maybe you could also define those terms for folks.
Absolutely. Thank you. I especially appreciate speaking with you, because you have a much more cerebral approach to journalism than many of your peers. So I appreciate to share some information that people might not get.
You've been around my show enough to know that that's definitely not always true, but I appreciate that.
Well, I dig it. And just to your point about, my voice on these constitutional issues, as an immigrant, it's very hard to overlook these threats. It's one thing to have a socialism that is grounded from a position of civilizational privilege, and we can locate that socialism particularly in claims to public resources and treating human needs as human rights. There's another independent dimension of democratic socialism, and that's preserving the opportunity for we the people to control our government. And as an immigrant fleeing the impacts of the US military industrial complex around the world, and the impacts, the post-colonial racial impacts in the UK and the former British Empire, I've seen up close and personal in my own family's history what that loss of civil liberties can look like. And so I do feel some privilege in standing sort of as a, with one foot in the past and very much an eye to the future, and trying to defend in the present these timeless values. To positive and negative liberty, negative liberties are the rights to be free from X, Y, or Z. For instance, in our Constitution, we have negative rights to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures, supposedly. From prior restraints on our rights to speech, again, supposedly. Take this with a grain of salt, because the words don't frankly find a lot of reflection on the ground. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Part of that relates to the co-optation of our courts and the right-wing assault on the judiciary. There's a lot of other pieces to put in there, but just to stay within your question, positive rights are rights to something, not just the right to be free from some arbitrary government intervention like a detention or being monitored or being shot by a cop, but a right to, for instance, food or shelter or healthcare or education. These are the rights FDR, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, spelled out in no uncertain terms. He wrote explicitly about a second Bill of Rights to enshrine in our Constitution not just the negative rights that we have been so proud of in our nation's history, but the positive rights that would make the promise of our Constitution actually real for the millions of Americans for whom it has been reduced merely to words on paper. I'm committed not just to defending the rule of law, not just to defending our democracy, but ultimately the reason I'm running for Congress, the oath of office says that we are there to defend the Republic and the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And you mentioned some of the groups around the world that have, including here at home, that have noxious ideologies. I want to be very clear. The principal threats to our Constitution, to our Republic, and to we the people of the United States include the President of the United States and the corporate members of Congress who are running our civilization off a cliff as if we were lemmings. And that's in the best case scenario. That was happening before the pandemic, right? I mean, I'm just talking about climate chaos there. And when you couldn't engineer a set of public policies to make a people more vulnerable to a pandemic, if you tried to have corporate for-profit healthcare, we didn't even have test kits available. And now, even after the stimulus package, great, you can get a free test if you can find one, but you still can't get treatment if you're uninsured. There was a 17-year-old who died in Los Angeles this week because he got turned away from an urgent care center because he did not have medical insurance. When you look at the graphs of the pandemic's expansion in countries around the world, we have one of the steepest curves, and it was entirely preventable. And it was the public policy paradigm of these threats to our republic, to our Constitution, our president's inaction, Congress's deference, and the corporate control over our public policy paradigm that has restricted access to the services not only that we need as individuals, but that we as a community need each other to have. There's in the same dimension, the distinction between negative and positive rights is similar, I think, to recognizing public goods in spheres that we have historically treated as commodity exchanges. Healthcare is not a commodity. It doesn't make sense to treat it as a commodity. It's a public good with massive externalities. And to reduce it as we reduce liberty and freedom to a strictly negative conception undermines the fuller thing that we have to protect. In one case, it's positive liberties. In the other case, it's public health. In all these arenas, we see the failure of a system, the bipartisan failures of a system that we can't take anymore. I mean, it's literally killing us at this point. And I don't have to say this to you being in New York, but I am deeply disturbed that thousands of people are going to die because of preventable failures of leadership. That's not acceptable.
It's evil. I think actually we can introduce that terminology, or it's, Achille Bembe, necropolitics. I mean, it is a death cult, and there's an objective reality to that and a subjective one. And yes, I mean, tons of people are dying preventable deaths because of this, and that cannot be forgotten, and it can't be, accepted. You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.